because ultimately now I think this is the important bit, because I would say, whereas at A-level, you could get away much more with a bit of sitting on the fence. You can do a sort of on the one hand this, on the one hand that, and maybe this. My experience here is people generally really don't like that. They want you to form an opinion on it. Obviously, you've got to acknowledge both sides, but at the end of the day, you sort of have to come down on one side. And so the earlier you can get that into your brain, especially for sort of interview in terms of critical thinking, is important.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with a new guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Sorry, I really should have asked this. Am I talking to you as if we forget the camera? Sorry, I realised you started it.
No, of course. Yeah, we can start again. Yeah, you're talking to me.
Okay, so I forget the cameras basically.
Yeah,
Got you. Okay,
yeah.
sorry. There we go.
No,
All good. Right, let's run. Take two.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with a new guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a first year doing his poll from Bristol and enjoying my time here so far. Yeah.
Nice, that's great. And we're here today to talk about advice for anyone who's thinking of applying to Cambridge, specifically what the year 12 process is like and how you found it. And when did you know that you were going to apply to Cambridge? Like, how did that decision come about?
Yeah, I think it happened over quite a long period in terms of, I think during year 11, I really enjoyed all my history. I didn't do politics A-levels, so that wasn't really something I touched, but I was always really interested in politics. And then I think it was sort of with year 12, and we had someone at school who sort of said, okay, here's a Google Classroom you join if you might be interested in Oxford. I thought, okay, I'll join that. And then just sort of doing a bit of research, it just seemed like something where I'd really enjoy. I remember really enjoying in class the sort of discussion parts, especially in politics. I had a really lovely politics teacher who would do a lot of sort of kind of discursive lessons. And I think that made me think, I'd really enjoy the supervision style of teaching, which is obviously unique to here. So in some ways, that was a bit of a sort of no-brainer to go and do that as one of my 5 options. And so I would say probably fairly early on to year 12, I thought, yeah, that's a path I want to go down, because it is 1 in 5. So I knew that if it didn't come off, that there were other options. It wasn't a sort of all eggs in one basket scenario.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's a point that's not raised enough, that if it doesn't work out, you still have 4 other applications.
Yeah, exactly.
So in year 12, when would you say, like for the year 12, so watching this, you should kind of start thinking about the application process?
Oh, it's the $1 million question, isn't it? Because I think there's a balance of, you have to bed in with the A-levels, and that transition's easier for some people than it is for others. Yeah. But then equally, you don't want to leave it so late that you'll begin to think about stuff towards the end of summer, starting year 13. I would really say after Christmas, I think, is the point to sort of start thinking about it. And I don't think that means you should collect a stack of volumes and think, right, I'm going to start reading a whole sort of set of works. I think it's sort of like, okay, what are the bits that interest me, and how would I like to progress this over these few months? So for some people, that would be, it was for me certainly an EPQ in one area, or if you've got an area of, particularly over history, really interested in, okay, is there an essay competition that I could possibly do for that? Is there a book that really works that, or maybe a new show? And just sort of, I remember taking a page of a notebook or a bit of paper, whatever, and just sort of writing down a few things. Okay, here's what I'm going to focus on at the moment. I had a sort of checklist. I thought all of this stuff I could write back in a personal statement. But I think the key element is just sort of giving yourself the time so that it all doesn't get rushed, because if you have to cram it right at the end, you're probably not going to have time to engage in the material that well. So you won't be able to say there's something that interesting about it. But then often, this is not what this is about, but when you come to interview, if you just flicked through the back few chapters of a book, you're not going to have the depth of knowledge to then be able to discuss it. So you want to give yourself the time to be able to really engage in stuff. If you want to write an essay competition, you want to have some time to do quite a lot of reading and write an informed answer. So it's a balance of letting yourself bed in with A-levels, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you don't get the grades, well then what's the point? But then you need to give yourself the time. So I would say sometime in that Christmas to February term, just sit down and think about it. Obviously, different schools will give you a different level of direction. I would say I went to a state comprehensive, but I would say I was lucky. We got support and we got direction on that. And so the idea of sort of super-curriculars was sort of drilled into us quite early. I think the one thing I will say, though, is I was massively under the illusion that extracurriculars were still a thing. Okay. So I definitely remember, I think there's a sort of Sydney Sussex webinar series I remember doing. I remember sitting down doing the first one thinking, oh, I can't just write about my sport and that sort of stuff, or music, or the other stuff I'd done. And so I definitely came in with misconceptions. And so to that, at my earlier point, the earlier you start, the earlier maybe if you do have some misconceptions around, I could write loads about my extracurriculars when you can't really, you can sort of get those out of the way and not be caught short later on.
Yeah, because I guess if you leave it last minute, it's more likely to be a very stressful experience.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And actually, with the personal statement, I think, not that I would encourage leaving it to the last minute, but I definitely was fine-tuning, basically I gave it to my dad a week before the deadline, who basically ripped the whole thing up. Not the content, but we just totally restructured and reorganized. So actually, the hard yards are done in the reading and the extracurriculars and stuff. And actually you can tinker with, because it's only 600 words now, or I guess it's the questions now, but it's only 3 boxes of questions. You can play around with that, tinker that, rip it all up the week before if you want to, whereas you can't suddenly, books, essay competitions, podcasts, whatever you want to do, you can't just do that all the week before.
Yeah. No, exactly. And so you're studying history and politics when, there's a lot of courses that are kind of similar, especially at Cambridge, similar to HisPol, like straight history or human social political sciences, HSPS. What made you choose history and politics and not those 2 courses?
Well, actually, I was quite set on history for quite a long time. I thought I would do history for a long time. And it was really my enjoyment of politics A-level that made me think, yes, I'll go down that route. I think ultimately I was very much guided by what I enjoyed. It seemed very sensible to me to go for a degree that I knew I enjoy, because it will be hard. I've had some hard moments here already. And so if you're doing something that you're really not that convinced by, I think that's not a route to particularly enjoying your time here or anywhere. So it was very much the sense of, okay, I've always really enjoyed history. I did history, obviously everyone does it up to year 9 and did it for GCSE, really enjoyed that. And then it was only really when I began to study at A-level that it was like, okay, this works well. I also think they work well together. I think they're well rounded and they complement each other. And the way it's set up here with the 1 history module, 2 politics in the first year is you get a good balance of both. And I get 12 supervisions overall, and I get 12 history supervisions overall, 12 politics supervisions overall, just the way it balances out. So they very much work together and the course is set up to do that. I think ultimately, I think there are no bad choices. I think all the courses here are brilliant. Everyone I've spoken to has great things to say about their DOS. So I think, if you go for one course over another, don't stress. Also, there is some flexibility. I had a friend that started here on MML and then switched to dropped one of her languages and now doing history and Spanish. So there is some, within reason. So I don't think, but everyone seems to be really enjoying it. So I don't think you can make a sort of bad choice. Do what you really want to enjoy, I think.
If you're choosing a course that you think you'll really enjoy, that's it'll be hard to make a bad choice for sure. I agree with that. One thing you said that's quite interesting. You were saying that you think history and politics complement each other really well. Do you think you can study politics without history, or without thinking about the concepts?
No, I don't think so. I think you can. Obviously, you can write an analysis that's rooted in the moment. Events of today, for example. But ultimately, a considered analysis of that will always have to take in historical precedent to understand the motivations and contexts of the current actions. You can't understand what's going on today in the Middle East without understanding, centuries, millennia's worth of history to really understand why motivating factors. So I think a good political understanding will take into the history into account. Certainly, yeah.
Nice, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and a very useful insight for anyone who's thinking of applying for history and politics.
And I will say something on that, which is I think if anyone listening is writing a joint honours personal statement, I think you have to have that in mind, or certainly I did when writing a joint honours personal statement. My suggestion would be try not to write it as half history, half politics, or maybe a paragraph on history, paragraph on politics, paragraph on history, paragraph on politics. you really want to intermingle it. I really went after subjects I felt could mix well. So I had a paragraph on populism, and so I talked about contemporary populism, Marine Le Pen, Trump, for example, but then tied into some of Mary Beard's work on Roman populism and how she argued that Caesar was the first person who sort of embodied populism in the way we might look at it now. And so I think really trying to, all the way through, you want to be weaving a narrative about both subjects, because although you will have, if you do a joint honors, I think most do politics interviews, history interviews, they'll still be looking for that thinking. I remember my now DOS Claire Jackson asking me a question about which current law would I repeal, a very contemporary political question in my history interview. So even though, you have different directors of your studies and they're separate departments here, the thinking is all interlinked. And so I would say a good personal statement should acknowledge that. And so it should all be interlinked. That doesn't mean that you aren't going to write you might have a really interesting, a great interest in passion in ancient history that might not have amazing contemporary links. And if you're really interested in that, definitely put it in. But definitely you need to have sentences and sort of linking clauses that really demonstrate you understand that the subjects are not separate entities. They are constantly interlinked. And I definitely think that helped me to an extent. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. I guess even in the ancient times, the behaviours might show themselves again in contemporary time. Another thing you were talking about, that's some people who are thinking of applying to Cambridge but might not have heard the term, is super-curricular activity. Can you explain for anyone who doesn't know what a super-curricular activity is and how that's different to an extracurricular activity? Can you explain that for them?
Yeah. So a super-curricular activity is one that relates to your furthering your sort of academic studies. And typically in the sort of context we're talking about, that means beyond A levels. It can be linked, but if you do, I did the French Revolution as one of my history modules, reading beyond that, podcast beyond that, how do I take my thinking further? Whereas an extracurricular would be something that's not directly academic, sporting achievements, sporting, not necessarily achievement, but music or theatre or anything like that, that isn't linked directly to academic study. I would say, I think it's nice to have a very brief comment on that in the personal statement. I think look like you're a well-rounded person, but a sentence at max, sentence and a half. But an extracurricular, super-curricular is something that's academic and is looking to sort of draw your thinking and expand your horizons.
Nice, yeah. And just to add on that, I guess it's super-curricular activities is activities that are just academic but related to your course. So if you're applying for music, then the music stuff that you do would be relevant. But if you're applying for natural sciences, the fact that you're a very talented musician is great, but it might be harder to relate to how it reflects on your drive to do natural sciences.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing you were mentioning was that you did a lot of essay competitions. Can you talk to us about that? And was that helpful with your Cambridge application, or were they independent things?
So I very much did them for my Cambridge application. Okay. I don't think if I hadn't got in, I wouldn't have regretted that, because I think they were really useful for my thinking. And actually, if someone listening does coursework, I think they're brilliant for coursework. I think it really, for my history coursework, I think it helped me immeasurably, because I'd already researched and written and referenced 2 full long essays, something I'd never done before. So I think even if you do them and you don't get in, I don't think it matters at all. I think they're great things to do anyway. But I did the Butler Politics Essay Competition, which is one hosted by Trinity. And then I did the Julia Wood Essay Prize, which is St Hugh's one in Oxford, which is history. So I did one for both. And I just really enjoyed them. I think it particularly helped that the Butler questions, I think they do 10 questions each year. And I did one about sport and politics. And I play a lot of sports. It was really interesting for me. So genuinely really enjoyed doing them. The big motivator was to be able to write about them in my personal statement, because I felt that I had to make an argument in the essays, and thus I could put the argument, I could put my own opinion in the personal statement, which I felt was really important to show that I'd looked at all these readings, all these sources, and I'd come to my own conclusions, which I think is a big part of the personal statement. Disappointingly, they didn't come up at all at interview, nor did my EPQ, nor did my coursework. So I think a lot of people have said that they didn't come up. None of that sort of stuff came up for then. So I think be wary that I imagine that sometimes interviewers won't always go there because they know it's probably quite solid ground. If you've researched a lot on essay competition, they're probably thinking they're probably quite clear on their arguments for that. So do it, but don't hedge your bets on it coming up in an interview if you do it. But as I say, I would encourage anyone to do it, even if they're not considering application to Oxbridge. Yeah.
Nice. And I guess maybe this is a dumb question, but doing like the essay competition is in itself a supercurricular activity.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's, broadening your thinking and broadening your horizons. I think doing ones that you feel genuinely interested in is very important, because you'll want to do other things beyond the essay competition. I think the way I very much approach my personal statement is I saw pretty much everything as interlinked, or try to make it as interlinked as possible. I really tried to sort of, this sounds a bit sort of crass, but I kind of try to tell a bit of a story through it. So you're trying to draw James, my doss here, would always say in essays, you're trying to draw a thread through. Yeah. And I think I try to draw a thread through. How did I go from start of year 12 to now, this is the end of my personal state, how have I traced that thread? And I put the essay competition as the end to try and sort of demonstrate that this was the culmination of my thinking. But it all, so the Julia Wood one on history I did on how the Nazis were able to get gold off Switzerland. But I linked some of that reading to some of the things that happened in the sort of funding of the Vietnam War that I'd listened to podcasts on. So all the way through it was interlinked. So it's a supercurricular, and it might feel like quite a standalone bit of work, but when you come to write about it in a personal statement, don't assume anything to be standalone. Try as much as you can to link everything through, because it shows that you're making connections the whole time, and making as many connections as you can is sort of the sort of thinking they're looking for, I think.
Yeah. No, that was really nice. And I think there's a really good point in how and the idea that an essay should be seen as like a story, in that it should be all connected. I think one thing Marcus said one time was in an essay you shouldn't be able to switch two paragraphs, and the essay shouldn't still flow, because naturally in a story, if you switch the order, it suddenly doesn't make sense. And if in your essay you can do that, it implies that maybe the paragraphs aren't interlinked.
I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. I think exactly the same is true for the questions now. If in a question box you feel you could sort of flip sentence number 2 with sentence number 5 and it'd be fine, it's not telling enough of a story, because it is not a checklist of things you've done. I think it's very tempting to, and I think especially people that are inclined towards an Oxford application, I think you're right, I'll do loads of stuff. But actually, less is more. What's your opinion on it? It's not a reading list, a comprehensive reading list of things you managed to read over the summer, nor is it here's all the essay competitions I've done. It's about what do you think about it? And so, tell that story all the way through. And if actually you think, okay, I've read 3 books on something, if you have read those 3 books, that doesn't mean you need to mention them. Actually, if you've only got something good to say about one of them, only list that you've read that one book, and then have 2 really good sentences about what you thought about that book, rather than 3 sentences explaining that you've just read 3 books, because you're not gaining or adding that much, I wouldn't say.
Yeah. It's showing what you've taken from your supercurricular activities, rather than just trying to name things that you've done. Yeah,
exactly.
I know you don't have your personal statement in front of you, but it's quite curious to know if you remember, in general, what was what was the start of your personal statement, and what kind of things did you write until the end?
So I can remember the start. So I was I'll start one way. I started with a quote, and then I can't remember why. Someone either at school told me that's a terrible idea, or I read something online that said it's a terrible idea because it's not what you think, is it? So I removed that, and then I had to just sort of, I think a lot of people start with I was interested in history and politics from a very young age. I was interested in English from a very young age. Always difficult. I think the starts of personal statements are very difficult. What I would say is you can't really nail it, and you're probably never going to be that happy with it, because it's a very short bit of writing and it's very difficult to get right. What I started with was that I was a chorister at Bristol Cathedral, and during that time there were lots of debates around the stained glass windows for Colston, the slave owner whose statue was toppled in Bristol. And so I said something like, in my 7 years as a chorister, I saw firsthand these debates. And then I was sort of saying how I'd had to written about that in my GCSE history paper. And then I sort of said something around, I've been interested in these sorts of dynamics since, and then moved on to the next paragraph. So I think an opening that reflects maybe an early learning, an early experience is really nice. But I would say don't get too hung up on it. Probably don't start with a quote, as I first attempted to do. But ultimately, I think the thing with personal statements is don't get too hung up on the individual lines. You want it to flow nicely. You want to have considered thoughts. But my understanding is I don't think that the person who reads it is going to sit and scrutinize every word of that first line, because they're going to have a whole stack of them. So if you're 90% happy with the opening, be happy with it, because I think the opening is quite possibly the most difficult bit to get right. As I went through, telling the story, it was the second bit was around my EPQ, which I wrote on building democracy in Afghanistan, and then kind of some bits around how anarchism has functioned in communes in Rojava in Syria, because that's sort of linked to kind of local governance in conflict areas, which is something I'm interested in. The next paragraph was kind of populism. Again, sort of started the next one with sort of linking around thinkings on different forms of governance and how they start and how that takes place. I can't really remember the third paragraph, but then the last paragraph sort of essay competitions, and then a couple of sentences at the end sort of extracurricular focused.
That sounds really cool. That's like your passion is very much coming through just talking about it, let alone reading your application. It sounds, and I think the opening, I mean, you showed something that's like really important about personal statements in general, that the start, what it sounds like was something that was very personal, in that when you started talking about being a chorister and Bristol Cathedral, I was thinking, where is this going? And then it turned in, I can hear like you're making like an historical argument and talking about the stained glass windows. And when as someone else reading that, you realize, oh, there's no one else who could have written this, because this person's talked about their experience and how it's related to the academic style.
Which I think is what makes it quite a nice way to start, if you can. I mean, I appreciate they're not, I was lucky that I think that fell, and I went to school at Bristol Cathedral Choir School, so it was literally around me. Yeah. So I think I was very lucky to have that to write about. But if you can, I think it's a really nice way to start, because I think it makes you stand out, because you can't, no one else can just pick that book off from Waterstones, then write, albeit a good line about it. Yeah. So I think it's definitely a good way to start. The other thing I would say around writing bits is that I put nothing in the My Cambridge application. I did all the forms, but the extra, I don't know how many extra words you get. Yeah. I didn't put anything there. I thought a lot about it. I thought, do I need to? But I actually didn't feel I had anything more to add. Yeah. And so I would say to people, providing they still do the My Cambridge application, if you feel that, if you have other things you want to write about, great, knock yourself out. But if you're like, I'm really happy with my personal statement as it is now, or I'm content with it, and I would just be sort of trying to come up with something extra, you don't need it. Don't get too hung up on it, is what I'd say.
Nice. So did you apply for history and politics for all the universities that you applied to?
Yeah, history and politics everywhere. So, yeah.
I think the My Cambridge application can be useful for a variety of things, but it's quite famously useful when you're applying for a course that's only given at Cambridge, or given at a few universities like Cambridge, but it's not the course that you're applying for elsewhere. So HSPS would be
land economy, I guess.
Or land economy, yeah. Because I don't think another university offers land economy, you might want to, your personal statement might be based on economics, let's say, but then your My Cambridge application might be a bit more land economy. But I understand for his poll, you might not want to, and you don't need to write anything in the My Cambridge.
But I think it's still tempting when it's there, and I would say, even though I think it does have a disclaimer, you don't have to write anything if you don't want to. I think if you're kind of like, I should, but you don't need to if you don't have the right words.
So the next thing that we've got here is there's like the phrase like critical thinking is mentioned quite a lot. There's some admissions tests that are revolved around critical thinking depending on which course you're applying for. It's also mentioned about with super-curricular activities, you want to be engaging with them critically. I was wondering, for anyone who doesn't know what engaging with something critically or what critical thinking means, can you explain that for them?
I think critical thinking is a bit hard to pin down. I would say the simplest way to think about critical thinking in the context of history, politics, those sorts of English, that sort of thing, is form your own opinion on something. If you are forming your own opinion, you have to, at some level, do critical thinking. You have had to read, listen, engage, and then come to some conclusion. So you, by the very nature of it, you've engaged it critically. I think, people pin down, oh, what is it? What isn't it? If you're just listening to something, then you kind of say, I like this part. Have you critically thought about what you like? I don't know. But I would say the easiest way to be like, what I am unambiguously doing some form of critical thinking is to listen to something and then think, I like this, I didn't like this, and this is what I thought about it. I just think beyond that, it gets confusing, and I think people get hung up on, have I looked like I'm saying something articulate enough or complicated enough? It doesn't have to be really complicated to be critically thinking. You just got to be engaging with arguments. I think a nice way I like to think about critical thinking is if you have two different arguments or slightly distinct arguments, what do you like about both of them? Where would you maybe draw your line between them? Being able to take on, two slightly competing views and then forge your own one, I think is a really nice way to think about it. And I think if done well in a personal statement or interview, can look really strong, because when you're here, we're constantly getting given often, bits of history that will cite different facts and different conclusions, or cite the same fact and draw different conclusions from the very same fact. And so your ability to look at different arguments and then come to a conclusion is essential to hear, probably. And so if you can demonstrate that in some way, you're demonstrating really good critical thinking. Yeah.
Nice. So in that application process, when would you say critical thinking is relevant, if at any point?
Well, it is obviously in the personal statement, but to the degree it's critical thinking, I don't know, because you're able to write about, you get, if you want, months and months to sort of type up all your answers and stuff. So you can, come up with good opinions and clever sort of lines. I think the stage where you want to feel like you're good at critical thinking really is interview, because that's the moment where you have to do it in real time. No longer is it 600 words and you get, a year to write it. It's, okay, I've been asked a question about this. I've been given this argument, this source. I've now got to interpret it. And so I think the best way to think about preparing for that sort of thing is just to be reading and thinking around this stuff. What are the arguments you've made in your personal statement? Find some different arguments. What do you think about those? Just engaging with different opinions on stuff. I think a really nice way to do stuff is lots of newspapers like The Guardian, for example, FT will have opinion sections. Find a current news story, an opinion section. If it's an opinion that's different to yours, so find maybe a paper of a different political leaning to yours, read someone else's opinion. Why do you not like it? Because that's when you're beginning to kind of sharpen the axe a bit and being like, okay, I can see these things. Now I think this. Because ultimately now I think this is the important bit, because I would say, whereas at A-level, you could get away much more with a bit of sitting on the fence. You can do a sort of, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, and maybe this. My experience here is people generally really don't like that. They want you to form an opinion on it. Obviously, you've got to acknowledge both sides, but at the end of the day, you sort of have to come down on one side. And so the earlier you can get that into your brain, especially for sort of interview, in terms of critical thinking, is important.
Nice. And I think I agree. Like, I think in the interview, whether you're aware of critical thinking or not, the nature of the questions that they will ask you will be requiring you to be thoughtful and discerning, and form an opinion, not be able to sit on the fence. Was wondering, how did you go about preparing for your interview?
I was lucky in which I got my politics teacher at school had been to Oxford, so he had a bit of experience. Yeah. He gave me a practice interview, and I had another one at school, which I was very lucky to have, and I appreciate not everyone gets that. Yeah. I would say the other things were, I tried to know my personal statement inside out and know the stuff you wrote about on the personal statement inside out, because I sort of think that's not the easy bit, but you are sort of setting yourself up to fail slightly if you don't know what you've written about and you can't remember the essay competitions you wrote. Just make sure that you know everything on there. The worst thing is you sit down, first question, it's the book on the personal statement you didn't read. It's like, cover all the bases first. And that's the sort of simple bit. After that, I think if you can have a practice interview, great. I also think you don't necessarily need someone coming back to you. You can, look at your personal statement. What questions might someone ask you? You've written that there. Okay, let's imagine, if I wrote, for example, and, Mary Beard argues that Caesar was the first form of modern populism, you could say, an interviewer might say, okay, how does, drawing on something contemporary, maybe how the sort of recent UK by-elections demonstrate some of Caesar's populism coming through now, for example. You can infer from what you've written here what someone might ask you, and you can practice, say it out loud. You might feel a bit crazy, but sort of practicing that sort of stuff, you can't really go wrong with. You don't always need someone right there pushing back on you. And often, sometimes, that can be beneficial in its own way, because one of the things I found difficult in interview actually is sometimes the interviewers won't come back to you on stuff. So you have to just say an answer out into the ether and then they'll move on. And so actually you've got to practice being sort of comfortable with giving an answer and then moving on. So actually there's often benefit in not always having someone coming back to you with a further question, going digging. Sometimes they'll go digging, but not always.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and then for some line of questioning they will go digging, but they will also move on. And am I right in thinking that the kind of like I guess, I don't know if it's anxiety, but the anxiety of when they do move on but not asking another question is whether you don't know whether you said the right thing or not, and to be kind of comfortable with that and be comfortable with the opinion that you shared.
Totally. And the other thing I'll say is be comfortable if you share an opinion they don't like. So I said something because I've now asked him about it. My current director of studies, James, I won't delve into it, but it's delve into it. Well, effectively, what I was trying to say was that, and I'm not necessarily quite sure still what I actually think about this, but effectively, talking about American politics, I was saying there's so much money sloshing around American politics that voters vote for someone, and I was saying I'm not sure you could always say they actually particularly know what the interest of that particular politician is. So basically saying the voters are slightly ignorant. And James said to me, I would run away from that by 1,000 miles. So I remember this was sort of 2 minutes before the end of the interview going, oh my God, that's gone. Oh God, I've totally, stuffed that up there. But, obviously it wasn't they obviously did let me in. And I've spoken about that with James Simpson. We've sort of chatted about it. And so actually, you can't really say a wrong opinion as long as it's within the range of sort of acceptable opinion to a degree. I mean, obviously that's contentious, but even if you say something that the people you interview actively disagree with, that's also fine. But further to what you were saying originally, be comfortable with the silence, and the fact they don't come back to you doesn't mean it's a good answer. In many ways, they actually might feel your answer is convincing and strong, and they don't really want to probe you because they feel you're well drilled on that area, and they're not going to sort of be able to tease out more from it.
There's time to move on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. So what you were saying, I think from my answer, your opinion about the voting in America kind of made sense. I was quite curious. What did James say in response?
I don't want to misquote him.
Okay.
I think effectively he was just saying that it's quite a dangerous idea to assume that the voter is ignorant, and you've got to be careful around sort of saying there are some people that know the interests of the voters more than they do themselves. But I can't. It was some time since we spoke about it. But it was something around that.
That is good.
I think we do disagree on that actually, and that's fine. And actually having different opinion is often better. They don't want necessarily for you to come in and just sort of, they don't want you to nod along and go, oh great, oh yes, I agree with that, agree with this, oh that's a great question all the time. They're looking for a bit of back and forth, because you'll find in supervisions that there is back and forth, and that you will draw different conclusions from the readings with your supervisors, and that's what makes it interesting being here.
That's interesting. That's a good point. I guess you can be both aware and misinformed, and then that might be a way to reconcile both. both points. Lastly, so students when they apply, is historically and to this day when they apply to Cambridge, they have to choose in a given year whether they want to apply to Cambridge or Oxford. And you can't apply to both effectively. I was wondering, did you ever consider Oxford when you're applying?
Oh, did I consider Oxford? Not really. Okay. I think two things. I think the rowing I rowed before I got here, and I think the rowing setup is a bit better here generally.
Oh right, okay.
Which is a very small reason, and I'd also say that it was a little bit further away from home. I live in Bristol, and that's what I wanted actually, just to be. Yeah. Oxford was just a little bit too close on the train, and actually just a little bit of distance. I think made it feel like a kind of. Yeah. I wanted that, and so they were very simple reasons. I think. And I would say this advice is also really true when applying to colleges. Just don't overthink it. It's not a really significant, obviously there is significance between applying to Oxford and Cambridge, but ultimately I know people at Oxford, got friends at Oxford who are having a lovely time. I've got friends here that are having a lovely time. You're not, there are differences between them, but don't get hung up on it in the same way there are not that many differences between the colleges, and don't get hung up on that either. Yeah. I think people get, people make spreadsheets about the colleges and they do all this sort of stuff, and they look at the admissions data, which obviously I know Marcus talked about length is slightly, you can't really tell much from it. And I think it's a bit of a lost cause really. I think just, go around. I mean, I quite literally went into Trinity Hall and thought, because they're all quite similar. And I went to Trinity Hall and thought, I quite like this one. And that's basically why I'm applied here. There was really not that much science to it. And I think people that try and use the science, I think you can come unstuck. I think. Yeah.
I mean, I also went into a college on an open day, looked around, and thought I'd choose that, and that worked for me, and it sounded like it worked for you as well. But I think if you're wanting a specific kind of accommodation, or if you're wanting a college in the centre, it would maybe a spreadsheet would be. I mean, for some people, a spreadsheet is the most
of course, that if you have specific requirements, you want some accessible accommodation, you want you think, oh, there's something there that I will particularly enjoy, great. But that's in the same way I thought, oh, I'll just enjoy this here. I would just say, if you're looking at kind of 4 or 5 colleges and you're thinking, I can't decide between them, don't agonize over that. If there is obviously one that works for you for whatever reason, great, and that's perfect. And if doing the research shows that to you, but if it's like much of a muchness between 5 or 6 of them, don't lose sleep over that. It's maybe I was a bit blunt the first time. But.
No. And what was it about the rowing setup that was like you thought was better at Cambridge compared to Oxford?
Well, I haven't been to Oxford, so I can't claim to have great knowledge. I think generally it's thought, the May bumps here, which is, I know you've had Flow on recently, but the May bumps, which is in next term, and it's just a much bigger thing than Torpids, which is the Oxford equivalent. And generally the boat houses are better funded and more people do it here. And so that was just a very simple reason. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's really interesting. I just didn't know about that as well. Well, thank you so much, Sam. Was there any lasting advice you'd have for people who are thinking about applying, maybe applying for HISPOL or then year 12 at the moment?
I would say two bits of advice. Yeah. The first of which is work hard on the A-levels and have the A-levels in hand. The whole process is easier if you are on top of the A-levels. And I think, I'm going to sound really boring here, but if you work hard in year 12, year 13 gets a lot easier. It's a stressful year, and especially if you do an Oxbridge application, because you do extra bits and bobs along the way. So being on top of the A-levels does make everything easier. The other bit would be try and enjoy as much of it as possible. I think when you have, people breathing down your neck right at the start of year 13 on getting your personal statement in early, and then you have, interviews 5 days before Christmas, or, try and just enjoy it, laugh at yourself when you can, because I think I found year 13 to be a stressful year. There were lots of it that I really enjoyed, but if you can take as much enjoyment from the little bits and bobs here and there, whether that be something work or outside of it as possible. And actually a third bit would be, don't get too bogged down in the work and the extracurriculars and the supercurriculars and stuff, it is important to sort of keep doing a bit of exercise and getting your brain out of it. I made the regrettable mistake of sort of dropping some of my sport as I came into my A levels, which I actually think didn't serve me very well. So throughout the year, especially when you get really busy, those are the points where to keep making sure you get outside doing your sport and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, nice. That's really that's really good advice. And out of curiosity, like, would you say how has the workload been less now that you're studying here compared to like the busyness of year 12 and 13?
Well, I don't know whether I should declare that on a public podcast. I would say it's a different sort of work, because I think with my understanding is with STEM students, I think it's a bit more consistent because they have problem sheets that roll around week on week on week. And so I think they're at a sort of higher level of consistent workload. I would say because I have supervisions, and although my history is scheduled, it's sort of 2, and then the straight history students have a reading week, and then 2, and then a reading week, etc. And the politics is all around. So it goes in peaks and troughs. So for example, in the last week of term, I have 3 supervisions on 3 consecutive days. So I'll have a big crunch then. But the last 2 weeks have been fairly relaxed. Yeah. So it's a different way of working. You kind of have to be on, and then you can sort of relax a bit. Yeah. But I would say the people that manage it well are the people that the humanities students that manage it well are those that try and turn their workload more towards that of a STEM student. So it's a consistency, it's a few hours every day rather than nothing for a week and then 7 hours a day for a week. Those are the people that seem to be enjoying themselves more, making most of the opportunities here. Yeah,
to manage your free time well.
Totally.
Yeah, because I guess the STEM students, they have say like the lectures every day, not every day, but like the same time every week, and the labs the same time every week until term ends. So there's a structure given to them.
Yeah,
nice. Thanks so much, Sam. A really good podcast. Talking about applying to Cambridge, what it was like for you in year 12, and I think it'd be really useful for anyone who's thinking of applying to Cambridge to like hear how you applied and to help them with their application as well. And thank you for the viewers for watching. If there's any podcasts that you would like us to do let us know, and let us know in the comments, and we'll try to make that happen. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you very much.
Nice. Thank you. How was that?
Yeah, it was good. I enjoyed that. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. It was good.